Oh, thank you, Elm. You saved the town from that evil defense mythic.
Hey guys, Z here. You know that Elm guy on the Elm banner that released a few days ago? Guess what? He's a very bad addition to the game. Thank you, thank you. I sure have talked about broken and unhealthy stuff for the game for who knows how long at this point. But there's usually that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 editions each year that make me question the thought process behind it. And Elm is no exception because he effectively killed Anima Season for who knows how long. And due to this edition, I have no qualms in saying Aether Raids is now more unbalanced than Summoner Duels, but it's less on the idea of dying on any metaphorical hill and more so digging a grave on said hill because I'm already dead. Also, I needed something to do today, and what better thing than yapping into a microphone for X amount of time. But that doesn't mean I don't have things to discuss. No. Like this massive misconception going on with Freyr, specifically because a lot of people are talking as if Elm is a Freyr counter. However, I'm going to pull the "they hated Jesus because he told the truth" card and say that's the wrong way to look at it. Rather, I believe people should see Elm and Freyr as their own independent entities because in reality, Elm's existence isn't really going to impact Freyr to any degree. Elm's existence of being able to inflict undefended after an action is absurdly ridiculous as is, but people aren't going to drop Freyr just because Elm gets around it. If they did drop Freyr on their defense teams, then they'd be open to so much worse stuff on Aether Raids, including undefended. See, it's funny because Elm already does that. I think the term people should be using instead of counter is counterplay, which may sound like I'm splitting hairs, but in reality, I am splitting my brain cells every time this game gets updated. The way I see a counter versus counterplay ultimately boils down to how it directly affects something in the meta. The easiest example I could use in this case is with Elamine, whose entire existence was to stop start of turn effects with false start. Freyr is a counter to Elamine because he negates her false start effect alongside any start of turn penalty, meaning other units on Aether Raid's defense are allowed to function as normal. There's no worry about res stacking a unit who failed res checks, and they could just naturally exist. Meanwhile, Elm being able to get around Freyr is counterplay to him because while Freyr can cleanse start of turn penalties, he can't cleanse anything that's applied during the turn itself. And this isn't a new concept with Elm. We've had plenty of units even before him that could stack penalties like that with Aether or anybody with Ruse or a Frozen or a Sabotage or any other thing I didn't decide to write down. However, Elm's existence doesn't mean I can now start running start of turn penalties because they will still get removed by Freyr. Elm isn't inherently a counter to Freyr because they function independently of one another, but Elm counterplays him because he can still inflict penalties during his turn. However, what Elm inflicts gets me to my entire point. Elm wasn't designed to counter Freyr. He was designed to counter Anima Season as a whole. Sure, in theory you may have defeated the big bad of Aether Raids, but in the process of doing so came at the cost of Saviors, which was the only notable defensive mechanism keeping Aether Raid's defense alive. Congratulations, Intelligent Systems, you saved the city. Yay. Honestly, I'd imagine if we didn't have half of the things we have in the game currently, Elm wouldn't be nearly as bad, but that's really hard to say. Really, the biggest problem I end up having with additions such as these is that they actively enable some of the freest strategies in the entire game. So free to the point where it's actively unfair. If there were at least other contingency plans to fight against stuff like mid-turn undefended without it also being overtly oppressive, then there'd at least be something to work off of. But the reason why these types of units end up dominating the game is because they remove the counterplay, and there's no telling how long it will take before something potentially worse takes their place as a result. But for the foreseeable future, Elm is going to reign as the best offense mythic in the entire game, and nobody else comes close to him. At least until they decide to course correct. But when it comes to the discussion of countering Elm, that's where it gets extremely messy. The only way to counter Elm besides them arbitrarily introducing a counter such as if unit is named Elm then he could go fuck himself is if they drop a unit that cleanses penalties during their turn, which I can tell you right now if you already hated Freyr's dominance in the game mode, then introducing a unit that cleanses penalties mid-turn will just end up becoming Freyr 2.0, and every good defense that you'll see around is going to have both Freyr and that unit, because there would be no way to inflict penalties anymore. So rather than IS continuing the cycle of making things worse by going from 100 to 100 every time they have to course correct, we need to find our own counterplay to Elm. I don't like what Elm does for Anima Season, but I think releasing a unit that negates all mid-turn penalties will be even worse for the mode as a whole. But because of that, there's nothing that could really be done about the mid-turn penalties going around, so rather than focusing on that aspect, I think it's better to look at everything surrounding Elm. And that's where I think Duma might come into play. Duma was always one of the more interesting mythics in the game. He was the first mainline mythic to be added into the game, and all he contributed was turn 1 chip damage and the ability to break an aether structure in his cardinal direction. It was also stackable, which meant that you could inflict upwards of 50 damage at the start of turn 1 and break every single building. This is completely irrelevant to the point I'm about to make, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to mention it anyway because I really miss the Duma line days. From what I remember, he was always a decent slot in Mythic, but he was never anything that broken. And then the Elamine Nation attacked and rendered most of Anima as good as dead until Freyr's introduction. In between those times, however, Duma also got his remix that upgraded his catapult effect to target the nearest breakable structure instead of cardinal only. It might actually be considered one of, if not the first effect that targeted the closest anything on a map-wide basis, which is way more familiar nowadays. And yet, regardless of quality, Elamine was there to shove her Staff of the Saint up his Dragon of the Ass, and even after she left the meta, Duma was just completely unnecessary. Now, I think it's very important to lay out the groundworks for this, not just because it pads the video, but because one key feature that makes Elm, alongside all of the other nonsense we have right now, dominate the game mode. There are several individual units and effects that are inherently strong by themselves, but the biggest enabler that makes these units as dumb as they are is none other than Safety Fence 2. Safety Fence 2, that came along with the Book 9 update, is an aetherate structure that allows the attacking player to stall out 2 turns before the foe can start moving in. This lets units like Emblem Lin Ring users, and accompanying hidden run units like Sigurd to pick off several units before the foe can do anything. 2 free turns to do anything in Aetherates is extremely strong, but if that safety fence were to break, then they can't stall for 2 turns. You see where I'm going with this? Hopefully, because I've been sounding it out for like the past minute or 2 or 3, I have not been paying attention, Duma can break the safety fence. In theory. The biggest problem really facing this strategy is that you have no idea where the fence is going to be located, and depending on where you put Duma, he may end up hitting an entirely different structure instead. That being said, there are ways to circumvent the risk, and that's by putting Duma in lane 3 or lane 4. I didn't directly mention this part with Upheaval earlier, which is the skill that allows him to break structures, but if there are 2 structures equidistant of Duma, then both of them will break simultaneously. And by having Duma in either lane 3 or lane 4, the likelihood of hitting a safety fence increases as it covers more ground. And at least from my own personal observations, the most popular lane for a safety fence tends to either be the 2nd lane, 5th lane, or 6th lane. This can also be paired up with the catapult structure for even more coverage. Placing it in a lane that is at least adjacent to Duma means there's less of a chance for overlap to happen, so at the very least, you have 1/3 of Aetherates covered, which is definitely not the most by itself, but increases a fair bit when you consider the amount of structures somebody brings. This part is especially RNG because you have no idea what kind of team you're going to face ever. It is all RNG for the most part, but not everybody brings the maximum amount of structures, which plays into Duma's strength even more because, as aforementioned, Upheaval will target the closest breakable structure. This, if nothing else, increases the chance of it breaking in. With all the high threat range units we have these days, it's usually better not to max out the structure slots. You could also run multiple Duma, but at that point you may as well hand over every win to the foe. But it sure would be funny. Also, if it wasn't obvious enough, you need Duma in the back so that he doesn't get targeted by Elm and then sniped on turn 1. Ideally, you have somebody in front of him too, so he'll most likely be able to survive for the first turn. And if you do all of that, then you might be able to beat Elm teams. Maybe. Listen, it's already a pretty dire luck when you have to go and use the first Anima Mythic ever released, but it's at least something as opposed to no thing. And if you can circumvent some lift loss in that way, then why the hell not, right? Maybe I should have talked about it earlier in the video, but there's an argument in favor of Elm's existence because it's against AI teams, which technically yes, but also that argument does not hold any water. Fighting AI in any other mode, regardless of how much stupid stuff you bring, is inconsequential, but Aether Raids is not like that because the opponent loses score. Beating up a bunch of arena teams doesn't mean anything to the foe because it doesn't impact their ability to score as high as possible. And I'm not about to claim that Aether Raids defense team should be unbeatable. However, I think having it favor offense to this degree is bad, and I would also be saying the same thing if defense was this favored as well. Ideally, it tends to favor offense more than defense. I think that is the healthier thing to do, but it always swings too far in either direction because IS goes to the extreme to course correct stuff that either shouldn't have been added to begin with or in the state that they were in. And maybe this is just a personal thing, but it's also really boring when it's too favored in either mode. I guess it's better than getting frustrated over nearly unbeatable teams, which I will agree with, but it's not exactly the most engaging thing in the world if I can just roll up with a Lin and Elm team all the time. And there's just no real incentive to do anything else if I could just get away with it. But if I had to play devil's advocate for a second, I think I understand why they added Elm like this. Even outside of the obvious financial incentives, having a modern unit that can make the process of dealing with defense teams much more convenient makes a lot of sense. Elm, for all intents and purposes, is a plug-and-play unit that requires effectively no investment to get going, whereas other types of teams, regardless of effectiveness, is not out of the box like he is. Not to mention, he's an offense mythic, so there's already a level of role compression that comes with it. And IS figured that it would be better to release Elm in this manner because of it. But this was too much, and you know what the worst part about all of this is? Even if this counterplay somehow works out, it probably won't mean anything later in the year if they decide to release a blessable version of Elm for the Book 6 Tempest Trial story. That would mean Elm on both Light Season and Astra Season, and Duma's catapult effect only works in Anima Season, so that's gonna suck. Honestly, if I had to look back at all the videos on this channel with a similar type of topic, I'd probably come to a full realization that I'm a broken record. But Elm is a broken mythic, and not for the right reasons, which is why this is the most relevant Duma content in the past 2 years. And yeah, that sure is the state of Astra Season right now. Will it get better? Probably not. Okay, but what if you ran 6 dual Marths on your Aether Raids defense team?